So welcome to my talk on fantasy football data. So a bit about me first. So who am I? I'm basically a data engineer, and I a love of data, but especially football data. And I've been playing with football data for probably about 12 years now. And it's just one of those things that when I started looking at it, I just wanted to understand if there was something in there where I could find a pattern. So once I got hooked, that was it. And it's led me down the route of various tools, and I've sort of like using Power BI to visualize. I've been using that now for quite a few years now because it's nice to use and there's some really good visualizations. So basically, why did I do it? Well, when I first started working on it, I wanted to see if there was a pi equivalent. So was there some type of statistical number that I can add to all the stats that I can get, so it would actually give me some advantage over people I'm playing against? I would like to say I'm still working full-time, so there isn't that magical number, but it has just led me down the route of sort of like just collecting as much data as I can to actually see what I can do with it and how I can actually select the various players for my fantasy football. So it started out with real football, and now it's gone over to sort of like fantasy football, but I do combine both together. So basically, what does the stats tell us? We could look at home form against away form. That's always been interesting. And up until sort of like COVID, home form was always key. But as we've seen over the last sort of like this year, especially, home form isn't there anymore. The away teams are doing better. Now, that could be the fact of no crowd. So is it a case of no crowds is causing that problem? Starting to look at newly promoted clubs versus existing clubs, another key area, because it's one of those things that, especially with playing with fantasy football, because those players will be cheaper. So if you could get the stats and you could pick the players, yes, the chances are you will pick someone that doesn't do well. But last year you had Lundstrom, this year you've got Bamford. So there is something in the data where it can actually give you some really good stuff. And the outliers, being a stats guy, outliers are really key, because it's one of those things that the outliers can really make you look at a player with a high score, but then you suddenly realized that he's not as good. It's just he's had one really good week. So when I'm collecting my data, I'm also looking at the outliers to see whether I should include them or not and how important they are. And it's some things that are no longer true. It's one of those things. It's sort of like, you know, a couple of years ago, Liverpool were always conceding. Then all of a sudden they got good. And it was Liverpool defenders were must have. That's not so much true. Caveat that with Robbo, especially after last night, he's doing okay. But if you look at Trent Alexander-Arnold year on year, he's really dropped. DCL was always overrated. Not anymore. He's a must. When you look at what Everton have done with him and you look at how good he is now, it's one of those things, you know, if you've got the front line of Bamford and DCL, you're going to get points all the time, as been proved. The crowd as a 12th man, that is sadly not there at the moment. And that is a result of COVID. And it is a case of, is that affecting the stats that we're seeing? Me personally, I believe it is, because you haven't got the home crowd actually sort of like making the away team fearful. So now it's a fact that the away team is doing better most of the time. And I've got some stats which I'll go through later, which actually shows the sort of like the away form of players against their home form. It's quite interesting if you like stats. And then there's the case of the wonderful world of VAR. So it's like you can't celebrate a goal now because you don't know what's going to happen with it. And that's the other interesting thing, which when I started looking at the data, which I've not done yet, but I've started compiling it, is there's this thing that, you know, like everyone sort of like said that certain teams were benefiting more from VAR than others. But in fact, when you look at it, that wasn't quite true. So it is, again, as I'm collecting my data to put into my models, this is something else which I'm going to take into account. And when we start looking at sort of like, you know, what's in the stats, it's a case of, you know, do the stats tell us something? Can they help us? And I always say yes and no in this case. Now, the reason why I say yes and no is you can have too much data, and most of the time having too much data is not a bad thing. But with football data, if you was to look at teams from 15 years ago to where they are now, they are totally different. Man City is a case in point. So it's a case of, you have to look at the data and you almost have to not look at it as Man City, Everton, Man United. You almost just have to look at it as the underlying stats to actually see what's going on. And again, that should help you then pick your players. And the most important thing, and again, I go through this when I do my demo of Power BI, is captain's choice. Captain's choice is so key because it is one of those things that if you've got a good captain, you're going to do really well. And it's one of those that a good captain can actually save a game week. It's happened to me quite a few times. And then to get to the truth, we need that data. So I use Power BI almost like as an analyst tool to actually help me pick what players I'm going to have. So I basically say, I look at it and say, right, okay, start of the season, I want my premium assets, defenders from the top 4, more likely top 6 now, premium midfielders who score for fun. So the likes of sort of like your Manes and players like that. And then you got your Vardy and the Kane as the must-haves. At one point, Kane wasn't a must-have at the start of the season because he never scored in August. That changed last season. Vardy is one of these players, again, Kane to a certain degree. When people look at form versus fixture, those two players, it doesn't really matter because those two players always can do something which turns a game. But the reason why I don't go for Kane and Vardy is their price and their return for the points based on how much they are. But that's just a personal preference. I like a good midfield. Newly promoted teams. I love looking at the newly promoted teams because it is one of those things that if you can get the right player, you'll laugh in. This season, it's Bamford. He's a sensation. And then the other thing is the formal fixture. There's a massive argument on Twitter over what's more important. I must admit, I look more at form than fixture, but again, that's a personal preference. And if you look at how well I do, I don't win all my leagues, so I can't say it's right. Players I play against to look at fixtures, they do really well. So maybe I need to change my the way I play the game. And then you've got the outer position players. Aubameyang is a midfielder. Who had him to begin with? I did, because I thought he was going to be a sensation. He bombed. Rashford is a midfielder. He's doing okay. And then I always use this from last season with Lundstrom. Set as a defender, playing in the middle. His points were absolutely fantastic. That little graphic, I do actually, when I'm looking at the data within Power BI, I do a point in time and also the total points for the previous seasons. And that just helps me sort of like see how good someone is and whether I should go for them or whether I should stick with them. And this is just highlighting the fact of Bamford. Now, again, the chart on the left is net transfers over costs. So as you can see, his cost has been rising and his net transfers has been really good. His ownership has really been going up. He's had very few times when people have sold him. And if you look at his points, he's got 75 points against all the others. That's really good. And again, there's Bamford and Calvert-Lewin very close to each other in the points. So it's one of those things that this is what I look for when I'm picking my players. Now, why do I look at the net transfers? It's one of those, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to predict when players will go down or up in price. Most of the time, people don't really care, but it's one of those that sometimes the difference between getting a player and not getting a player could be 0.1 of a million. So if you wait too long and a player goes down or a player goes up, you could just miss out. So again, it's the type of charts that I use to actually help me pick my players. Going back to the who to captain. Now, this is just something where I've just put some players as captains. This list is just what most people go for. So this is their points across the season so far up to now. Total points, Kane and Son on 107 and 105. That's not really a surprise considering how good they've been. Everyone's waiting for Son to stop scoring, but he's in such impeccable form. He could keep going. Then you've got Salah's up there again with Vardy. And then you've got some of the other players. KDB is a bit of a surprise because of how low he is. But what happens if we was to actually say, right, okay, when I was talking about home and away earlier, how does that look? Well, if you look at it, Mo Salah's got the most points at home. But the important ones for me are your Son and your Kane. So when you look at Son, out of most of his points, he's got a higher percentage away from home. The same is with sort of like Kane. So there is something in there, which is the away form. And as we was talking earlier, it was a case of you take someone like Bruno away from home, as we can see. Bruno 27 at home, 56 away. That's really good. So is it a case of the away form now is not, the players aren't being affected by the crowd? So in fact, they're playing better because the home side haven't got the crowd behind them. So I just thought it was interesting. The only one that's actually done better at home than away, if you look at it, would be KDB. He's got 29 at home, 27 away, but they're quite low numbers. And this is one of those seasons where everyone is beating everyone. It really is anyone's title. There's less points between sort of like the top 7 or 8 teams than what there is between the bottom 2 teams at the moment. It's an amazing season for looking at football data because everything we know is being thrown out the window. So it makes it really exciting. It could be anyone's league, and it won't be like last season where 2 teams ran away with it. This year, pretty much anyone can win it. Even Southampton could win it the way they're playing, and they're pulling out some really good results. Now, this is, again, I'll go through a live demo in Power BI with this, but this is where I'm looking at the form of players. Over the years, what I've basically done is I'm looking at a roll in a group of games. I picked on 4, so I'm just looking at 4 games. So sort of like at the moment, we can see that this is it's highlighted between 9 and 12. And again, we can see Son is the highest on 31. But interestingly, this run of 4 games is not as good as if you go back to the 8 to 11. Why, I don't know. But it's one of those things. This is what I'm looking for. So I can actually, with this chart, I can actually see who is the form player. And as we can see, I can choose a captain because I've got a flag for certain players, which is being set to this could be a captain. So I can just look at that. The differential, I'm basically looking at anyone that's less than 3%. As we can see, there's only a couple in there. And then I could do it by position and then team name is if I so wish, but more, and I can actually see the injuries, which is quite important at the moment because so many teams have having injuries. So these are just charts I create, which actually help me pick the players. But the upshot, predicting fantasy football is really difficult. If it wasn't, the same people would win year in, year out. Another contentious part about fantasy football is how much is luck and how much is skill. You need both. You need the skill to be able to know what teams to pick the best players for, and you need the luck for your captain's choice. Because as I've said, I've had game weeks where my captain has got me 70% of my weekly points. First game week, I had Salah. He got 20 points, which gave me 40 as a captain, which meant that, you know, I only ended up with 56 that week. So that was a really good week to get the right captain. This week, I went for KDB as captain, so it didn't quite work out. But fortunately, he got the bonus point. So even though he didn't do much, I still got 8 points from it overall. But when you look at it, you've got player form, player injury, player rotation, the famous Pep roulette. It's one of those things, how many times have we sort of like looked at Sterling or Mahrez and they've basically been interchanged, so we've lost out. And no crowds. This year, no crowds is affecting it. And I go back to the away form against the home form. It's a lot more sort of like level playing field now. Because I collect all this data, one of the things which we have been looking at is, am I ever going to use AI to actually start predicting what's going to happen? So I'm not sure, because of you need big data sets for AI, but the problem is footballers, you know, over time, they will be affected. So your data sets are slightly less. But this is looking at Harry Kane over the last 4 seasons. This was the one where basically I'm looking at the top row is how many points he's got for that season. And then the point in time is how many points he's got up to game week 12. Now, the reason why I use point in time, because it gives me some kind of a judgment on how was he doing against previous seasons, so I can actually see whether he's going to get more. This season, it's obvious he's going to blow his previous points totals and get the best points he's ever had. But then if we look at the same one, if we look at Richarlison, but this was before last night's game. But as we can see, he's doing worse this season. But the interesting thing is, if I was just to look at this, you would basically say Richarlison's not worth having. But there is another part to this chart where I actually look at how many games they played and how many minutes. And if we look at Richarlison, he's missed games. So his is lower, but he's played less. So again, there's times when we can actually look at that information to actually say, right, okay, how can we use this? And just a very, very brief overview on how I collect my data. So basically, I collect my data in one of two ways. I have a sort of real time, and then I just have my batch. My batches are things that happen on a weekly basis, points for the players from Fantasy League, the game results. But then I have I call it near real time because it's the transfer data. I use an API and I pull down the transfer data for the previous 15 minutes. So, and we'll see that on a chart within Power BI. So this is just running permanently, and then I get the net transfer from it. 15 minutes was chosen because that was the only time the data changed. If you went less than 15 minutes, it was still the same. So you were storing data with no real meaningfulness to it. So basically, I collect the data, put it onto, I've got a storage area, and then basically I've got scripts that run to populate a data model, which is SQL Server, SQL Server Express, and then I use Power BI to connect to SQL Server to visualize the data. When I use Power BI, I do very little within Power BI. I use it purely as a visualization tool. I do most of my grunt work within the database and when I'm feeding the data in. The premise of that was many years ago, I thought, do you know what, someone might want this. And so I can actually just give it to someone and they will understand how it works. No one's really wanted it, but I still built it. So I built it very modular. So I got my API that collects the data, and I collect data via Python. It all goes into SQL databases. I have a data model in the SQL database, which then Power BI connects to. It works okay. Looking at some of the stuff earlier from Ryan, I was really wow, that's why I need to be not doing this, because that was absolutely fantastic. So let's have a quick demo on my Power BI. Right. I take it you can see my Power BI.
Oh, yes.
I was just about to say I clicked on something and then it went off. So basically, I collect data from 23 leagues, and I've been collecting the data from around about the last 20 years. I go back 20 years. I've only been doing this 5 years. So basically, this is my landing page. So all it tells me is the different leagues I collect data for. So from a fantasy football perspective, it's only the English Premier, but I also look at other data. Along the top, I can look at different years, and then what will happen is these will change. This bottom one, points by teams, is basically showing me fantasy points by team. So we can look at the moment, if we look at the top three sides, they're Spurs, Chelsea and Southampton. So if I was to right click and then I could do a drill through to the players, what this will actually do is then it will actually give me a view on what players are doing what for Southampton. So I can actually look at overall, how many points they're getting, the goals, and then there's just some more information there. So it starts to show me who are the players for those teams. So now I know from the first chart that Spurs, Chelsea and Southampton are the top players. I can then start to say, right, okay, they're the sort of teams I want to hone in on. And so that sort of helps me to actually decide who I'm going to have in my team. Position scores, this is again is a point in time. So once I've got the teams, another thing I can look at is actually to see how the different positions are doing from previous seasons. So if we look at it, the midfield are doing a lot better than previous seasons, not massively. If we look at the goalkeepers, again, the goalkeepers are not as good as previous seasons. Forwards, not as good as previous seasons. Defenders, not as good as previous seasons. So it starts to help me see where, when I start to look at my data, where I'm going to start to pick the players from. So now I can start to say, like when I said earlier about premium defenders are not, I had Trent Alexander-Arnold for weeks, and that was just money sat there doing nothing. Get rid of him. I brought in Zuma. All of a sudden I'm doing okay, and then I can reinvest that in the middle. I got Fernandez in and he did really well. So it's just using this, it just starts to help me decide where I'm going to start picking my players. Now, teams and players, now the interesting thing with this, I've clicked on Chelsea, but I've got other teams there. Now, the reason being, if I was to look at that, this is based on, we can actually see that there's players that have gone from Leicester to Chelsea now, but because I'm looking at it historically, I can actually see where the points were done in previous seasons. So I can look at the moment, I'm looking at defenders, so I can start to see, you know, historically, Marcus Alonso has been good. But when you start looking at the green part is this year. So historically, Marco Alonso has been great, but this year it's Kurt Zouma. And we can actually start seeing now, you know, Chelsea's defence this year is better than in previous years. So it starts to help me start seeing, okay, what positions are good and what positions are bad. If I was to look at Liverpool with the defence, it's bad this year compared to previous seasons. But then last season, if we was to look at Trent, so if I was to click on him now and I drill through to my year on year, we know he's doing bad, and we can clearly see that he's doing a lot worse than in previous seasons. But this is the part where, you know, he's missed some games, so he's not doing as good as what he did. So he's on 24 now, where in previous seasons he was double that. So it's one of those that, you know, that's one of the reasons why I sold him. But if we was to look at something like Southampton, we can actually see, wow, let's have a look at Vestergaard. We can clearly see that he's doing much better and he's more consistent. So all this starts to show me is it just starts to, I could go from team down to players. So it just enables me to start honing in on who I want to pick. So you can sort of like deselect, and then it really sort of like it's too busy then, so you know you wouldn't want to do that. So hence why, you know, I do it at a team level, because I think that's more important. Right, now this is where I start to look at the player form. I've actually got I got a player form and overall form, but I'll look at the overall form, because on the overall form, so basically what I can actually do is I can say, right, okay, I just want to do it by the captains. Now the captain is a flag that's set, but as we can clearly see, we can see, you know, who's got the most points out of all these in the last 4 running game weeks, and then it just starts to show me that, well, actually, you know, Son, this was before yesterday's game, so he had Liverpool and he's got Leicester, Wolves, so I can start to see, if I was to go back again, we can actually see it was Fernandes, because he had a blinder, but he had 17, 11, 10, then he had a 6. If we go back again, it was Bruno. So when we start to see it, we can start seeing over a 4-week period which players are actually sort of like starting to be the ones to go for. I need to resize some of this because we can see the bonus points and the game scored. Now, bonus points can be quite important. In a game like last night, I chose KDB as captain. He didn't do much. Well, he did a lot, but he didn't score. But he still got 2 bonus points. All of a sudden, 2 went to 4. And then I got 8 points for a captain. That's not my worst captain of the season. I took it because it was just one of those games. So if I go back to teams and players, and we look at Man United, and then we look at the midfield, and then I drill through to price versus transfer. This is where, again, we can start to see, you know, like Bruno, he's done well, his price has gone up, but we can see that he's been picked and he's been dropped. So again, when I'm looking at this, what I'm trying to do is use Power BI to actually highlight what players I should be looking at. There's still a lot of manual work in it, because I still have to go in and select. You know, the ideal place where I want to be is that I will, you know, it will flag up 20 players, and then I know exactly who to play for, who to go for. But at this moment in time, I'm not quite there. So I'm still sort of like at that position where I'm sort of like building up all the data, looking at what the data tells me. Once that data tells me a specific story, I can then build that story into a different data model, which then will help me select players based on it telling me, rather than me having to go and look. I'll only show you a couple more because I'm wary of the time. I did come up with a fixture difficulty. This is just based on the one that the FPL give us. So again, I could just basically look at over the next couple of weeks who's got what fixtures. That's just an average of difficulty. So we can look at, say, right, okay, Brighton have got Fulham, Sheffield United, West Ham, and then Arsenal. So their average fixture difficulty over those 4 weeks is quite low. So it will tell me, look, well, actually, I may want to start looking at Brighton assets. So, you know, and in one of the other charts, Gross was one of the players that was in form. So again, it's just telling me who I might go for. Final chart I'll show you. There's loads. I could talk about Power BI all night, but I'm just worried of time. King of the week. So basically what this is doing, this is looking at who's got the top points in the game week. So if we look at this, basically what this is saying is Fulham have had the most points scored against them for the most weeks. This is why I used this to pick my captain at the weekend when Liverpool had Fulham, and it blew up in my face. So it doesn't always work. But if we have a look at it, then if I was to click on Son, it tells me he got 24 points against Southampton, 18 against United, 11 against Burnley, and these are the weeks it's done it. So again, what this is telling me who's ranking the highest overall for the points in that game week. It's no surprising that Son and Bruno are at the top, because as we've seen on the player form, it's a case of, you know, Bruno has been massively consistent over sort of like the most game weeks. And he does score goals other than penalties. So there's lots of other stuff which I use. I've been playing with the tree just to help me, but this is just one which we're currently playing with. And as we can actually see again, I'm always looking at point in time to see where the points are against previous seasons, so that I can start to see where my money needs to go in the wonderful world of fantasy football.
Brilliant.
Right.
Brilliant.
So I was going to show. I was just going to show. I'm only 16th in this league, so it's one of those things that it's helping me. It's the data's providing something to help me choose what I'm doing, but it's a work in progress. I've been working on this data for 12 years, and so it's sort of like something. I'm lucky. I'm really interested in this. So got a job as a data engineer. Then in my free time, I build data models for FPL. So I will actually, there was just one more chart, which is the auto select is what I wanted to get to. So it actually tells me what I can pick. I started sending SMS texts based on the data that was in Power BI and then the ML. So there's lots of, and this chart, I started doing the R in Power BI to actually see if it would actually help me predict what players are going to score. It was quite interesting, but it didn't actually get me to where I wanted to go. So I'm very much one of these. I'll try something. If it doesn't work, I would then move on. Yeah. So thank you for listening to me rambling on about football data and Power BI, but that's pretty much me in that for now.
That's useful. Thanks. Just go back one screen, will you, on your PowerPoint? I always like those. Not that one.
Yeah, I just wanna,
as you say, to do VML, of course, you do need some massive data sets, and
yes,
and past performance is no guarantee of future. You'd be looking for, well, obviously, trying to search. Yeah, that one. Trying to search all of the data that you've got to try and find those correlations and the yes, groupings of data sets to say, okay, yeah, Harry Kane hasn't performed this week, but he will do because a player of a similar standard did this X years ago, and we can find that kind of grouping and data set.
Yeah, because I'm pulling the data from the FPL and they got the ICT index. What I've tried to do is actually, when building the models, is look at the player as a group of variables as a player. So you're right in what you're saying. So it's a case of sort of like saying, right, okay, when a player has these variables, this is the likelihood of him doing something. And this is why I started using R in Power BI, just to actually see if I can, if it would actually sort of like look at, the fixtures. It would look at the the ICT index and other stuff to actually say, time of the fixture, day of the fixture, weather, to actually then sort of like say, well, actually, we predict this player has got these variables. A player with similar variables got this in a previous game week. So we think the probability is that there's a 85% chance that he's going to get a minimum of 6 points.
Yeah, and that's exactly where you want to be, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. It's I can't imagine the amount of effort you've gone to over the years to produce that. Much as Ryan said at the beginning, you get home from your day job and then you just get consumed, and then all of a sudden you look up and it's 10 or 11 o'clock of night, and you've solved one little problem. Anyway, that's why we're all fanatical about this stuff. All right, superb. Thanks very much, Jamie.